Hello, my name's Julian Edgar and I'm the author of the book that you see in front of you, Modifying the Electronics of Modern Classic Cars. What I want to do in today's video is to show you how you can move the battery to the other end of the car. So if your battery is normally mounted in the engine bay, as it is in most cars, you can move it to the boot or the trunk. That gives you more room to install other devices in the engine bay, and also has some of the other advantages. For example, you can fit a bigger battery if that is an advantage to you. Let's start off by looking at the problem that I was facing. Here is the under hood view of the Nissan Maxima V6 Turbo that I wanted to install an intercooler. The trouble is, that's where the battery was. So this is the view after the battery has been moved to the other end of the car, and here's the intercooler that replaces its location. Here's the battery in its original location. You can see that it had to be moved if there was to be enough room created for the intercooler. The first step was to remove the battery and then to unbolt the battery tray. Some battery trays are spot welded into place, and so you would need to drill those spot welds out, but this one was easy. It was just bolted into place. Next step, we have the ground lead. The ground lead, the earth lead, normally goes to the negative terminal of the battery, say from the engine block, but here the battery was going to go a long way away. We need to run only one wire back to the battery in the boot or trunk, and that's the positive lead. We can ground the battery in the trunk, and we can ground this lead in the engine bay, and then the engine body acts as a big lead that connects them. But you must make sure that where you are attaching that ground lead is to a bare body part. So I have scraped away the paint from around this particular bolt hole so that I can bolt the lead into place. To allow me to bolt the lead easily to the bodywork, I simply cut off where the red line is. So I cut the battery clamp off. You can see that the bolt that goes through the that eye terminal then can connect straight to the bodywork, and there it is. So you don't have to crimp a new terminal on. If you don't have a big crimping tool, that can save you considerable time, and also means that you've got a really good electrical connection. So the negative lead here connects from the bodywork to the engine block. That's the one that originally connected to the negative lead of the battery. What about the positive lead? Well, that has to be extended to connect to the battery at the other end of the car, and you want a really good connection. You want a really good electrical connection. So here I've cut off the original terminal to the battery, the original positive terminal. I've left the bolt there just as I did for the negative lead, and I have attached a strong new terminal to the red cable that's going to go to the battery in the boot in the trunk, and I have bolted them together. Now, we want to make sure that that connection can touch nothing, otherwise we could easily create a fire. And so I have wrapped it in heat shrink, and then I have wrapped it in some rubber hose before I have clamped it into place. So it can't move, it nicely connects. Here is the original battery lead, here is the new lead that's going to the other end of the car, and obviously under here is the junction that I just showed you. Here's the, incidentally, the negative lead that I showed earlier on. Now, here's the car in all its glory. It was an old car even when I did this modification, so now it's even older. You can see I've got the new length of red cable. Now, what I've chosen to do here is to go to a welding supplier shop and buy a length of welding cable. You can get very heavy gauge cable, you can get it in red, and it's cheaper. You can buy it by the meter or by the yard. Always make sure you get at least enough. It's a hard cable to join, and so I've got that red cable lying out of the engine bay. It's now connected to the wires that we saw a moment ago, but now it's got to be run to the other end of the car. Now, I started off by running the cable around in the engine bay. Incidentally, I also covered the cable in plastic sheath. You can see it, the plastic just starts there, clear plastic tube to add another layer of insulation for when it went under the car. But started off, I just ran it around the engine bay, clamping it into place all the way around. And then at this middle point of the engine bay, I headed south to go under the car. The actual path that you take with that battery cable is obviously dependent on the car. But make sure it doesn't go near hot surfaces, and make sure it can't get abraded through. Remember, if it touches the bodywork, the conductor inside touches the bodywork, you'll have a short circuit. So there's the cable. You can see I've got quite a lot of it. I think it was 5 or 6 meters, 5 or 6 yards. I wanted to have plenty, and by the time you go a slightly circuitous route, yeah, it's easy to use up quite a lot more of the cable than you first expected. Now, under the car, you can see here's the cable just drooping down a little bit there, and you can see I've got lots and lots of cable ties as I tie it into place. They're only about 6 or 8 inches apart, maybe 15 or 20 centimeters apart. You do not want that cable to droop down on the road. You do not want, even if a few cable ties were to break, you don't want it to be fouling on the exhaust that we can see in the background. You really want it secure. Notice how I've tucked it up behind the chassis rail, so if I did scrape on the road, and there's the chassis rail on the other side, you can see that if I had it tucked up there, as I have on this side, it's tucked up quite a long way from the road. If you scrape, you certainly don't want to be scraping your battery cable. Here's an underneath view where I didn't use cable ties. I have used clamps and screwed, or I think it's a pop rivet, into place, and you can see also the outer plastic sheath that I slid the cable through just as that extra protection. Has to go through into the trunk space, has to go through underneath the car into the boot space, and you must use a grommet. Do not just stick it through a sharp-edged hole. In any wiring on cars, you always take into account that the car is vibrating, is shaking, and so there will be chafing of wiring, and obviously if it chafes against a sharp edge over time, even over years, it'll gradually wear its way through the insulation, and the result is potentially a fire. So take special care when running battery cables of the sort that you're showing you here. Here's that battery tray that we took from the engine bay. In this case, I'm reusing it. I'm cutting off that extra bracket here, and I'm stripping this back and then painting it black so I can use this as the new battery tray. And looking in the trunk now, you can see the freshly painted battery tray in the bottom of a plastic battery box. A battery box is good because if you are putting the battery into the load space and you have all the terminals open, then you might have a metallic load float around inside the trunk or the boot and short circuit the battery, which obviously would be a disaster. So actually enclosing it in a box, a plastic box designed for batteries, is a really good safety technique. Now, notice here I'm using 3 bolts to hold down the tray. The battery will get strapped down to that tray. You must restrain batteries, especially in the cabin area of the car, and this car had fold down seats at the back, so it was the cabin area. In an accident, you do not want the battery, all of that weight, bursting forward and smashing into people. And remember, even a 3G deceleration, the battery weighs 3 times as much as it does normally. A 5G deceleration, 5 times as much. So that's why I've used the load spacing washers here. If I could have used 4 bolts, I would have, but it was very, very difficult to do any more than 3. The load spacing, load sharing washers stop the bolt heads pulling through. And when we look underneath, we can see I was able to bolt either side of the very strong chassis member, and again I've used washers to spread the load so that those bolts won't pull straight through. Always use spacers, or sorry, not spacers, but washers, load spacing sharing washers to stop the stuff pulling through, stop the bolts pulling through. Now, at the back, here we are at the back, we have to connect the ground terminal to the bodywork so that the bodywork acts as that big wire to connect to the ground terminal that we did earlier in the engine bay, and all the same things apply. You need a nice clean bolt to attach that wire to the bodywork so that the electrical connection is good. If you are installing a battery in the back of the car, it makes a lot of sense to put a high current circuit breaker in. Now, even though the starter motor might draw 150 amps, or in a bigger engine even 200 amps, it's because it's such a short duration, you can normally get away with a circuit breaker that's not even rated that high. So for example, a 100 amp circuit breaker will typically not trip with the starter motor, but will trip if you have a really great big short circuit. And you can also, if you don't want to buy a circuit breaker, you can also buy 100 amp fuses, things of that sort. But good idea. So if any of that cable actually chafed through or touched the bodywork, even in an accident, then this would trip and you wouldn't have basically a fire. Here's the final view, looking in the boot, the trunk. There's the battery box with its cover on, so no terminals are revealed. Where the cables had to connect to the circuit breaker, there were terminals that were revealed, there were terminals that were live, so I've put this plastic cover, just folded up an acrylic cover and placed it over the top. Still get your fingers in to reset the circuit breaker if it's actually needed. So there's an example of some of the content that's from the book, a simple one of moving the battery to the other end of the car. The book has got dozens and dozens of projects, step-by-step photographs, including modification of engine management, including moving batteries, including intercooler water sprays, upgrading sound systems, upgrading lighting, almost everything you can think of that you might want to electrically or electronically modify in a car of this sort of era. Thank you.